Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pitts. This is Ukraine War Frontline update for the 21st of August 2023. Before we get to the frontline, let's have a look at what all the lines mean. Please pause the video if you want to go through what each of the colours mean. They all pretty much refer to Russian defensive lines at different points and by different mappers. Okay, now let's go and have a little look at a general comment here. The army of the Russian Federation has serious problems of counter-battery capabilities on all sections of the front, especially in the Zaporizhia direction. This is something I've been reporting on a lot. The Russians have had their artillery attrited to the point where they are complaining in numbers. We are seeing an awful lot of Russian sources complaining that they have no counter-battery support, and that is a huge issue for them. There's also a little bit added here that analysts report that the units of the Russian armed forces are experiencing a shortage of officers due to a lot of manpower, and that privates are commanding some Russian companies that should be commanded by a junior officer. So that is yet another challenge to the Russian armed forces there. Right, let's go to the northeast sector, the Kupiansk to Svatova to Crimea front line, and we're going to look at the Kupiansk area in particular. Quite a lot of activity around here, arguably, although there are some claims that there are over-egged advances from the Russians. I withhold my judgment on that for the moment. The ISW Institute for the Study of War American Military think tank says Russian sources have claimed that Russian forces have steadily been advancing northeast of Kupiansk for the past several weeks, although corresponding visual confirmation corroborating these claims has yet to emerge. Russian sources previously claimed extensive Russian advances southwest of Svatova, with that visual evidence has yet to confirm. This is still an ongoing issue, that actually from this whole area there really is very little evidence that the Russians have made the territorial gains that they have claimed, and you would think that if they did have that evidence they'd be shouting about it. So that is quite something to raise one's eyebrows over. Okay, this suggesting that Russian sources may be engaging in a wider pattern of exaggerating Russian advances along the Kupiansk-Svatova line. Russian sources may be exaggerating their advances to portray localized offensive operations as more threatening in order to support the Russian effort to draw Ukrainian forces away from more operationally significant sectors of the front. The problem is, with doing that, if they are doing that, and I'm not saying they are, but if they are doing that, they are assuming that Ukrainians are going to be using just the evidence of Russian claims as to what they do on the battlefield, rather than actually the reports of their own commanders in that area. And if they're saying no, they haven't advanced, then it doesn't matter what the Russians say. It's not going to act to get the Ukrainians to commit forces to that area. So I don't know whether that rationale, that either says that the Russians are stupid, or that in fact they really are making those advances, because that kind of rationale doesn't make any sense. So I'd just be cautious about what is going on here. I am happy to confirm that I don't know. The Russians could well be advancing at the rates that they are claiming, but likewise, they might not be. A Russian mill blogger did acknowledge that Russian forces are struggling to advance near Sinkivka and Petropavlivka due to Ukrainian minefields. This is something I've been wondering about myself, how much of this area is mined. I argued the reason that the Russians made such quick advances around the Karmazianivka area up to Ryarodka, this sector where you can see the advances from the white line there, was probably because the Ukrainians won't have mined these areas as heavily as the Russians have in Zaporizhia, and so it's relatively easy for the Russians to advance, and that could well be the case up here. However, the Russians are complaining that they are coming across minefields. So I wonder whether, as the Russians started to advance, you then started seeing Ukrainians launch some ram shells or something that litter mines in the area, rather than having an already extensively mined set of fields and obstacles. To continue, the ISW, Russian MOD claimed that Russian forces repelled 6 Ukrainian assaults near Vilshana and Sinkivka, and even Ivka, that's where we're talking about now, and also Novosilivska further to the south. Russian forces continued limited operations in the Crimea area on August 20th, so yesterday, and made marginal gains. Geolocated footage published on August the 20th indicates that Russian forces advanced northwest of Crimea, and Russian Mill blogger claimed that Russian forces advanced near Bilohorivka as well. So there could be, so we can see some gains here. This is according to Syriac maps, and they have made some subsequent map changes actually very recently. This came from last night, which is that the Russians are continuing to make small advances south of Vilshana in a direction of Petropavlivka. That's on the way to Kupiansk and sort of surrounding Sinkivka there. Then they've just come out with these claims saying that, if we just show you the map first, the situation northeastern front, the news of the capture of Sinkivka are far from reality. So there are some Russian sources claiming that Sinkivka has been captured, and they're showing footage of that. People like Defamon have showed that that footage is not correct. In fact, no, it's not that one. We're going to come on to that in a minute. Yeah, so be warned. There are claims about Sinkivka that are not correct. So Surat Maps is right in calling this out. Russian forces continue advancing in the flanks of the town, while the Ukrainian army is slowly withdrawing from it to Kupiansk, where battles are and Petropavlivka, where battles are approaching. Moreover, it is true that battles are taking place at Kislivka, but their reports are not new. Combats have been taking place on the outskirts of the town for some weeks as Russian troops improve their positions close to the railway. This is Kislivka further to the southeast. Okay. Russian advances remain small and localized, aiming at keeping Ukrainian troops on these fronts occupied as well as bringing in new reinforcements. However, news of the blowing up of one of the bridges over the Oskil River, as well as evacuation preparations on a number of new settlements. So this is, broadly in the Kupiansk area, there are claims of this. This time, the northern border of Kharkiv Oblast suggests that Russian major offensive actions could soon return and move from positional battles to a major operation. For this, however, we'll have to wait until autumn, they say. Now, this goes to what I was talking about in one of my news pieces at Kupiansk. The Ukrainians are blowing up bridges as Russians advance towards the city. Now, this does seem time stampable to now, but is it last year? We don't know, because actually there are some claims that that footage, it's fake. The video is old and is showing Voronov, which is 110 kilometers away. Nobody is leaving Kupiansk, and that would assume that nobody is blowing up the bridges going into Kupiansk. So that footage I showed you earlier might well be incorrect, but I'm not sure. I've not seen video evidence that suggests that is incorrect. I have seen video evidence to suggest that the claims of Sinkivka are incorrect, and that video was indeed referring to someone else. Defamon has that geolocated on his thread on his Twitter handle, so you can check that out. So as we come further to the south, there's activity in Kislivka there, where the Russians have been pressuring a lot. I don't really know what's happening around the Kuzmivka and Novoselivska area, other than there are repelled attacks apparently from the Ukrainians there as they're pushing to the east, trying to take back some lost territory in Novoselivska. And I'm not 100% sure what's going on really around the Karmazionivka area, other than sort of activity still, but not quite sure who has the momentum there, because it did swing back to the Ukrainians. Is there anything else of note? So here we have Kupiansk, according to Getty, operational situation in that direction. To the north of the village of Sinkivka, positional battles continue during the day. Aerial reconnaissance of the armed forces of Ukraine captures a movement of enemy deep reconnaissance groups without changes. So this is to go against what Surat Maps is saying, that actually there are no changes around Sinkivka. It's broadly a straight line across there, more so than we see with Surat Maps, that has the Russians having some a bit more of a salient there. Getty is saying that it's more like what Andrew Perpetua has. Anyway, to continue, they say, and east of Sinkivka, Russian troops are trying to advance and gain a foothold along two forest belts in the grey zone. The situation is dynamic without change, which is a complete contradiction. It's dynamic and not dynamic. So I'm not quite sure what he's trying to say there. But yeah, it is. I suppose it's potentially dynamic, but at the moment there is no change. would how I would interpret that. Right. If we go to the ISW, they do talk about geolocated footage published on the 20th indicates that Russian forces advanced northwest of Crimea. So if we're going to come out of this very northern part of the northeast sector and we go to the Chervonopepivka area, there are claims here, and this is north of Crimea, that there are some gains for the Russians. What is this? This is the defeat of the Russian T-72 tank with a first-person view drone. So I don't know actually that. Well, we shall see. Let's plug this in. This is where a Russian tank has been hit by a first-person view drone. Let's see if it is across. No, that is pretty much where you'd expect a Russian tank to be. I don't think that shows uh, any advance. That is a Russian defensive line. You'd expect them to be operating within the grey zone, uh, quite possibly. So I don't think that indicates any advance for the Russians in that particular area. So I disagree with the ISW there. Right, okay, let's move on now further to the south towards Bakhmut. We're going to stop at Sperna, which is just to the north of Brestova. Here it is. So Sperna there has seen quite a lot of activity over the months as the Russians have slowly moved forward, taken hold of this facility there that had some underground bunkers or whatnot, underground uh, facilities underneath it as well. That were very useful for the Ukrainians. Now the Russians seem to be in control of that area now. There are claims that they have lost quite a bit of equipment in the area. Russian armored convoy was obliterated in the Sperna area, 15 kilometers northeast of Bakhmut. This is apparently the armored equipment graveyard around there for Russian vehicles that seem to have fallen foul of Ukrainian ordnance. So that is good news for the Ukrainians, but we don't know whether they have made gains there on the back of that. That we've seen this near Berestova, further down here, where the Russians have made gains, but that has come at the expense of quite a lot of equipment over the months. And then we come into Bakhmut, where we still don't have all that much information about what's going on in the north of Bakhmut. Things seem to be quiet around the M03 or E40 highway coming to the north of Bakhmut, the ground line of communication or main supply route. Dubovo Vasilivka, all of that seems to be rather quiet. Bakivka as well. The whole of Bakhmut seems to be somewhat calmer than it has been more recently. Tendar says Russians continue to frantically attack Klishchivka to the south of Bakhmut, but they have a huge problem. The Ukrainian positions overlooking the village from which any movement can be monitored, and Russian troops can be effectively repelled. Is That's happening on a daily basis. So like I've said several times now, if the Russians attack Klishchivka and take control of Klishchivka, then they're putting themselves in a very difficult position because the higher ground to the west means that you can easily take out targets within Klishchivka. And then there were high losses for the Russians as they tried to outflank the Ukrainian vantage position by attacking from the north using 3 main battle tanks and 3 infantry fighting vehicles. That's been geolocated to around Klishchivka there, and we've got a destroyed Russian column to the south. This is kind of flipped around this map 90 degrees, and we've got a Ukrainian position on high ground possibly there. Um, so actually, no, ooh, no, that's to the north. Sorry, goodness me, right. Let's go and plug that into my map because actually this could be fairly significant. Right, so this is the destroyed column of Russian equipment. Right, so that's in the grey zone. That is beyond the Russian defensive lines, and if they are attacking in a column, that's where you'd expect them to be. You wouldn't expect the Russians to be attacking behind their lines. They will be going in the grey zone towards the Ukrainian positions, wherever they may be. The Ukrainians appear to be in control, I would say, of the top ground around Klishchivka here to the west. So the Russians moving into kind of potentially Ukrainian controlled territory nearby. That is significant, but they took quite a beating. It appears that they lost heavily lost quite a number of pieces of equipment. I won't play this forward, but you can go and watch it. It's linked on my news video this morning. Just it ends up with a lot of blown up equipment there. So that is interesting bit of geolocation. Now, if we come further to the south of Klishchiivka, we have Andriivka, where here you can see Deep State map has shown a tiny bit of Ukrainian gain in this area, just sort of north of Andriivka. There, Andrew Perpetua, the blue line, suggests that Andriivka is a grey zone, and I would probably agree with that. Surrey maps and Deep State think that the town itself is still, or the village is still in control of the Russians. Here we have Global War Monitor agreeing more with Andrew Perpetua, and then showing a northern area and a southern area now being controlled by uh, by the Ukrainians here, adding to the liberated status. So they say this particular one is about 1 square kilometer added to the liberated status. So the Ukrainians appear to be having some kind of success around there. If we go to the ISW Institute for the Study of War again, geolocated footage published on August the 20th indicates that Ukrainian forces have reached positions further west and north of Andriivka. Although it is unclear whether Ukrainian forces still hold these positions, and that's always a good point to make. You might see them in a position and think, right, they control that, but they could move in and then move out or get repelled very shortly afterwards. These areas, these sectors, as ever, are dynamic. Right. So this is geolocated to there, and that could be why Deep State Map has changed the mapping for this particular area. What has happened there? The Russians are attacking the Ukrainians there, so that's Ukrainians in position, and the Ukrainian tanks were forced to withdraw from there, which might suggest that actually that's now grey zone. Although that part north of Andriivka is well, yeah, actually, that is great. So that is grey zone. Global War Monitor saying much further up here is now firmly under Ukrainian control. So that's more up there. So that would suggest that the Ukrainians tried to get into that area, but were repelled from there. And then we have Ukrainian attempting or Ukrainian attack attempt. So it could be exactly what was just being hinted at there. After the proves that after the destruction of 3 T-90Ms, just 700 meters further east of the railway slope, that the area is grey and Russians cover it with artillery. Russian tanks are already at least 3 kilometers back east of the T-0513 at Odrydivka. Okay, what's all this saying? Well, it's that the Russians are, entrenched here behind the railway line. This is a natural, not natural, it's a man-made embankment, but it's a barrier that is it's kind of natural because it was already there, rather than them having to build something up to defend. So this is a good line for them to defend, and we already knew that they are stacked up behind Odrydivka in terms of quite a bit of equipment there that will be hammering the Ukrainians as they try and move forward. So that is that's only 4 kilometers. So you can easily hit targets as it appears the Ukrainians had a hard time trying to attack north of Andrivka, it shows that it's tough for both sides. They are both losing a lot of equipment, but we have got quite a bit of intel that the Russians have lost some serious mechanized equipment around Andrivka and Klishchiivka. Right. So, other than that, I mean, there are claims from the Ukrainian MOD that they have taken 3 square kilometers around Bakhmut over the last week, which is certainly a slowdown from what they were doing, but it does show they're still making gains. They're just not very precise about where those gains are. I think Bakhmut has really slowed down. I don't think they need to make advances around Bakhmut. Just as I've said many times before, they need to fix the Russian troops there and hopefully even attrit them. But fixing them is their primary goal, and they are appearing to do that successfully. Right, Avdiivka, sorry, not too much to be mentioned about there. It is, as ever, mentioned in the ISW, but there is a lack of where is it? Yeah, just a lack of territorial exchange. It's usual places being attacked around there, Pervomysky and whatnot. Now, there is some news, however, about Krasnohorivka to the south of Avdiivka, not the one to the north. There's a Krasnohorivka there. We're talking about the Krasnohorivka near Mariinka here, where there was, well, there is, well, pretty much was. It's a former mine now. There's a mine that the Russians attacked a few weeks ago, and there was a whole procession of vehicles that were absolutely hammered. And then the Russians supposedly, took control of the mine, but the mine was hammered by Ukrainian artillery, and the claim was that the Russians pulled out of there. Suryat map still has it under control of the Russians, this was also where a Telegram, quite a prominent Russian Telegram poster, mill blogger, who was also a drone operator, unit commander, I think, was killed here as well by cluster munition. So this has been the scene of quite a lot of activity. Now, some footage has come out to suggest that the Russians might still have been there. So Surat maps could well have been correct in their assessments. It's difficult to know sometimes whether some people existing in that means that they control it, because you don't know whether they're in there, they're out, it's movements, so on and so forth. But nevertheless, Ukrainian forces using tanks and artillery successfully conducted an assault on several large entrenched positions of Russian forces south of Krasnohorivka. So War Monitor here is saying that there were large entrenchments of Russians there. The Global War Monitor, another source, says similar, that Ukraine has pushed the Russians back from Krasnohorivka area, and the footage here is of um, of I didn't know that tanks had such good audio systems in them. That's pretty impressive. But yeah, they're taking out this buildings and positions in this mine. Uh, it doesn't necessarily prove that many Russians were there or perished or whatnot. It's just a lot of tanks firing at two tanks firing a lot at the mine. So that is the situation there. But good news for the Ukrainians in that they seem to have pushed the Russians out of that position and back towards Donetsk. Right. So all the south, very south western suburbs of Donetsk, Petrovsky district. Okay, as we move on down from this area, we're going to come on to the Urzhany Velika Novosilka sector. And actually, I don't even have a tab for it. That's how much isn't coming out from here. With no news really of any significant activity, or at least territorial exchange. And I don't know what this tells us, to be honest. So ISW does talk about there being, both sides claiming the other side is attacking and repelling them. Russian forces conducted offensive operations there, but did not make any confirmed or claimed advances. The same with the Ukrainian forces. Working in around all the areas we've talked about previously, Kamenchik, Novodonetsk, Zavitne Bazhanya, working towards Staromelnyivka, Priutne. I don't know of any other details concerning those positions. So I am going to, rarely move on quite quickly from that sector to Robotno, where there's an awful lot to be said. There seems to be an awful lot of activity going on there and quite a few claims. We'll start with just having a look at this map, and I showed you this earlier, just the entrenchments around here. You've got Tokmak there. The Russians, the pink line represents the most recent trench building they've done, which is kind of joining up a couple of lines here, quite importantly, to give a robust second, or you could argue a third line of defense here. And then these orange lines, you're just wondering, why are you bothering building these kind of shorter trench lines here that can be easily flanked? I don't quite understand the rationale there, but nonetheless, that shows you the extent of the trench lines that are already there, and the idea that the Russians are still working to build them up as we speak. Okay, so Suryat Maps has some gains for the Ukrainians here, small advances east of Robotna, and then later on to the northwest of Robotna, coming down through the town. Most people seem to think that the Russians are no longer really in Robotna. Suryat Maps still has them operating in the southern outskirts of the city or the town, village. Um, but yeah, I don't know. There are various claims. I'll go through some of them. Heavy fighting in the central part of the village, and then it was like moving on further to the south. The grey zone was the center. Whole village is now the grey zone, and the Ukrainians in control of the north. And then Ukrainians taking control of an area towards Verbove, only 3.4 kilometers from Verbove. So let's go and have a look at that as we come in and look at Robotna here, Novopokrovka, and then Verbove here. So 3.4 kilometers. Um, so yeah, that's about where you'd expect them to be uh, there. So the Ukrainians are taking ground there, and then we have video footage to show that Ukrainians are entrenched in the center of Robotna. Um, Going back to the village here, so definitely successfully entrenched in the center. I would say Surret Maps is having a very charitable interpretation of the data for very charitable for the Russians, but they do admit the Ukrainians have taken quite some significant land actually here uh, to the west of Robotna, and that makes it increasingly difficult for the Russians as they're flanking Robotna on both sides. Andrew Perpetua's mapping the slightly lighter blue color here. This pin suggests that, and thank you so much to JR for helping with the mapping, of course. This suggests that the Ukrainians have made some gains to the east as well. We go back to some of the sources. Um, we then have Romanov, a Russian war blogger, saying that actually Ukrainians are in control of 50% of the village. And then we heard that actually they're in control of the whole of the village. And that's generally where we're at the moment. Not quite sure. There are still some Russians who are claiming that there are skirmishes going on the very south of the village. We have further gains for the Ukrainians just to the east as well, 2.4 kilometers from Novopokrovka, which is really significant because actually this is an important town for the Russians to hold on to. After that, you've got your next line of defense. I mean, it just means that the Ukrainians will have successfully negotiated themselves through that important first line of defense with the masses of minefields that there are there. So it is going to be costly for the Ukrainians around here for sure, but they do appear to have uh, to be having continued success there. This is for her junior pro-Ukrainian source saying Russian sources report the collapse of the Russian army and the village of Robotny is under the control of the Ukrainian armed forces. I think this is probably a bit uh, over-optimistic. We await official confirmations. In my opinion, it was a matter of time before the collapse of one of the most fortified villages on the front that the Russian army is in retreat anyway. They recorded the Ukrainian army's control of some strongholds east of Robotna village and improving their tactical positions. In recent days, the Ukrainian armed forces have bombed the positions of the Russian army in Novopokrovka, which is practically the code to open a safe. The opening of the first line of defense in the direction of Tokmak, in the direction of Melitopol, I had to draw more or less the main line of defense in yellow to give you an idea. So it depends which kind of direction they're going to go in. The Russian armed forces are in total panic because they are forced to send their reserves to Kherson, to Robotna and Verbove, to Staromenivka and the kind of Velika Novosilka salient, and to Bakhmut as well. And there are also possibly attacks in the Droznyanka area, which I've talked about a few times over the last few days, between here, Robotna, and the Velika Novosilka salient over there. You've got Droznyanka, and it could be that there is a new front opening there for the Ukrainians. So this is a very positive view of what's going on in the area from Fahir Jr. But he said I've always been optimistic. I think he is being optimistic there, but I think as well there's generally good news. Interesting video from Robotna, breaking new video from Kyiv Post, reportedly from this morning, shows Ukrainian tank and infantry fighting vehicles firing at Russian positions in the southern end of Robotna. So this might lead towards the idea that the Russians are being cleared out of Robotna. And here we have the geolocation. The problem is when you have this, I mean, I think that means that that's where the tanks are and they're firing on the south. Of course, that pretty much is I mean, you've only got these few houses here as being places where Russians can still remain. So the Ukrainians are there and firing to the south, then I'd say pretty much the Russians are going to be out of Robotna, and that will be in Ukrainian hands fairly robustly round about now, I would have thought. Um, uh, yeah, nothing more to say with that. Now, this is going back to the Institute for the Study of War that say the geolocated footage published 19th and 20th shows that Ukrainian forces recently advanced east. These will probably be out of date now. That you have destroyed Ukrainian equipment by the Russians, which means the Ukrainians are here in order for the Russians to take out this equipment. So here, that is, yeah, what we'd expect, given that would be the grey zone. You'd expect there to be Ukrainian equipment being taken out in places like that. And here, Russia is shelling Ukrainian positions. Let's see where these Ukrainian positions are to see if that fits in with where we have the map. Just trying to draw up a picture. Yep, again, you'd expect Ukrainian positions to be there. And then remember, that's 2 days ago now. So that's, yeah, exactly what you'd expect. So it seems like the mapping is uh, is defended by some video evidence and geolocated evidence. I'm fairly happy that these lines, particularly actually Andrew Perpetua's blue line there, I think the Russians are not in Robotno, and wouldn't surprise me if actually the Russian defensive line looks a little bit more like that. Really, and you might have a grey zone operating there at the moment. Be also interesting to see how many uh, basically mines and trenches are in this area, and how difficult it will be for the Ukrainians to advance down to the edge of Novopokrivka. Uh, yeah, that's going to be obviously what's going to be taking place over the next day or so, and then that's the end of uh, the information we have for this area. There is no real detail coming out of the Piatikhatki area. That seems to have gone quite quiet, very positional. We're going to move now to Kherson and Dnipro River area, where Andrew Perpetua has finally, and I say finally because it's something I've been expecting for some time, uh, changed his mapping to show that the Russians have been pushed back from the Antonivsky Bridge area, where he's still had them holding out there. Even Surat maps didn't have that, and he's now changed to have them much further back here. We saw footage earlier on, sort of about a month ago, or maybe 3 weeks ago, of Russian vehicles being taken out along this stretch of the road here, and indeed coming over the Konka River and on this curve there. So Ukrainian artillery can successfully hit any kind of Russian target around here, but the Russians have been hammering the Ukrainians that have got a foothold, trying to hide under the bridge often. They're getting hit with aerial guided glide bombs and all sorts of stuff there. But also, Andrew Perpetua's changed this into being a grey area and pushed the Russian line right back along this part of the shore, if you can call it that. Here, I mean, there's a very small part of the river possibly coming down there, but the main river is over here, and actually the Russian defensive line has now been pushed considerably back, as according to him, and that is really significant. Now, what I just don't know about is what's happening in Kozachi Lahiri. So here, Andrew Perpetua never did have this marked as a salient for the Ukrainians, but Surat maps did, and many other mappers did, and there was just not a lot of talk about what is going on here. So maybe the Ukrainians had been pushed back out of this, but there were claims that they had quite a strong foothold there, and they were pushing in two directions. Whether the Russians really panicked and threw everything at that area, because obviously, if the Ukrainians succeeded there, then that's big trouble for the Russians. They could have thrown everything at that point and pushed the Ukrainians back, as has been claimed. But then there's just a lot of operational security coming out of here, and we just often don't hear about what happens until a week after it's happened from a Ukrainian point of view. It could, yeah, or it could be that Ukrainians are still operating there. I just don't know. As far as what the ISW says about this area. They say Russian sources claim that Ukrainian forces continue to operate in the islands in the Dnipro River Delta. A Russian mobile blogger claimed that fighting is ongoing on the islands and that Russian forces continue to shell Ukrainian positions near the bridge, Antonivsky Bridge. Another mobile blogger claimed that intense Ukrainian shelling does not allow Russian infantry to engage Ukrainian forces on the islands in the Delta. So there is effective Ukrainian shelling there. This is yet another area where the Russians complain that they have very little counter battery fire too. Anyway, that's the update for today. Hopefully that was of use to you. It's a lot about Robotna, really, not a huge amount of detail about many other places. Anyway, please like, subscribe, and share. Really appreciate all of your support. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon. Oh man, could do with being there now.